I'll never forget the sound of my suitcase hitting the front porch steps as my father-in-law Harold literally threw it out the door. The metallic clang echoed through the entire neighborhood on that cold December morning, and I could see curtains twitching in windows across the street as neighbors peeked out to witness my humiliation. "Get your worthless behind off my property, Sarah, and don't you dare come back," he bellowed, his face red with rage as spit flew from his mouth. My husband Mark just stood there behind him, looking at his shoes like a coward, not saying a single word to defend his wife of 8 years. The Christmas wreath on the door seemed to mock me as Harold slammed it shut so hard that the whole house shook, and I could hear my mother-in-law Diane sobbing dramatically inside, probably already calling her church friends to tell them how that awful girl had finally pushed poor Harold too far. I stood there on the porch in my pajamas and bathrobe, shivering in the December cold, holding my 3-year-old daughter Emma, who was crying because she didn't understand why Grandpa was so angry at Mommy. But here's what Harold didn't know as he stood there feeling so powerful and righteous behind his expensive oak door. Here's what made his face drain of all color just 2 hours later when I returned with my lawyer and a very important piece of paper. Here's the secret I'd been keeping for 3 long years, waiting for exactly this moment when his true nature would finally reveal itself completely. The beautiful 3-story colonial house that Harold was so proud of, the one he'd spent 15 years renovating and showing off to everyone in the neighborhood, wasn't actually sitting on his land at all. When my grandmother died 4 years ago, she left me something in her will that nobody in Mark's family knew about: 23 acres of prime real estate in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in Connecticut, including the exact plot where Harold had built his dream home. My grandmother had sold him the house itself years before I even met Mark, but she'd been clever enough to retain ownership of the land underneath it, and when she passed, that ownership transferred directly to me. I remember the day I first found out about the inheritance, sitting in my grandmother's lawyer's office while Mark waited in the car outside, completely oblivious to what was happening inside that mahogany-paneled room. Mr. Peterson, Grandma's attorney for over 30 years, had spread the documents across his massive desk and explained everything in his careful, measured way. "Your grandmother was quite specific about this, Sarah," he'd said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he pointed to the property lines on the survey map. "She wanted you to have security, something that could never be taken away from you, no matter what happened in your marriage." I'd stared at those papers in shock, realizing that my sweet, quiet grandmother had somehow foreseen the toxic family dynamics I'd be dealing with, and she'd given me the ultimate insurance policy. The land was worth over $2 million, but more importantly, it gave me power, the kind of power that Harold had been using to control and manipulate our entire family for years. For 3 years, I'd kept this secret locked away, watching as Harold treated me like dirt under his expensive Italian leather shoes. Every family gathering became an opportunity for him to remind everyone what a disappointment I was, how Mark could have done so much better, how I was dragging down the family name with my common background and state school education. He'd make snide comments about my cooking at every holiday dinner, loudly wondering why Mark had to settle for someone who couldn't even make a proper Thanksgiving turkey. When Emma was born, he actually had the audacity to suggest that maybe she'd inherit more intelligence from Mark's side of the family, because clearly my genes weren't contributing much to the gene pool. Diane would always giggle nervously at his jokes, and then pat my hand condescendingly, saying things like, "Oh, Harold, you're terrible. But you know Sarah doesn't mind your teasing, do you, dear?" while her eyes dared me to contradict her. The worst part was watching my own husband enable his father's behavior year after year, making excuses and telling me I was being too sensitive whenever I tried to address the constant disrespect. Mark would pull me aside after particularly brutal family dinners and whisper things like, "You know how Dad is, just ignore him," or "He doesn't mean anything by it. That's just his sense of humor." But I could see it in Mark's eyes. He was terrified of his father's disapproval, still seeking approval from a man who ruled his family through fear and financial control. Harold held the purse strings for everything: Mark's job at the family construction business, the down payment for our first house, even Emma's college fund that he'd started, but constantly threatened to take away whenever I didn't fall in line. Every major decision in our lives had to be approved by Harold, and he made sure we all knew who was really in charge of this family dynasty he'd built through decades of manipulation and emotional abuse. But that December morning, when he threw me out like garbage, something inside me finally snapped into perfect clarity. As I stood there on the porch with my crying daughter, watching the neighbors whisper and point, I realized I was done being his victim. I was done protecting his fragile ego and his precious family image. I was done letting him treat me like an unwanted stray dog who should be grateful for whatever scraps of respect he threw my way. So I buckled Emma into her car seat, drove straight to Mr. Peterson's office, and asked him to prepare the documents that would change everything. It's time, I told him simply, and he smiled the kind of smile that told me he'd been waiting for this phone call for 3 years. Within 2 hours, I was standing back on Harold's porch, but this time I wasn't alone, and this time I wasn't leaving until Harold learned exactly who owned the ground he was standing on. The look on Harold's face when he opened the door and saw me standing there with Mr. Peterson and a sheriff's deputy was absolutely priceless, like someone had just told him his precious Mercedes had been repossessed. "What the hell is this?" he sputtered, his usual commanding voice cracking slightly as he tried to process why his discarded daughter-in-law had returned with what looked like official backup. Mr. Peterson stepped forward with his briefcase, calm and professional as always, and introduced himself with the kind of authority that comes from 40 years of practicing law in Connecticut's most exclusive circles. "Mr. Harold Pemberton, I'm James Peterson, attorney for Mrs. Sarah Pemberton, and I have some documents here that I believe will be of great interest to you regarding this property." I watched Harold's eyes narrow as he tried to figure out what game we were playing, clearly annoyed that his morning power trip was being interrupted by what he probably assumed was some desperate legal bluff. Diane appeared behind him in her silk robe, clutching her pearls like she always did when she was nervous, whispering, "Harold, what's going on?" in that breathy voice she used whenever she wanted to sound helpless and confused. The real story of how I ended up in this toxic family dynamic started 8 years earlier, when I was just a naive 22-year-old working as a receptionist at a dental office in Hartford. Mark had come in for a routine cleaning, and I'd been charmed by his easy smile and seemingly genuine interest in my dreams of going back to school for my master's degree in education. He was 25, worked for his father's construction company, and seemed like the kind of stable, family-oriented man my own mother had always told me to look for. Our first few months of dating were like something out of a romantic movie. He'd pick me up in his shiny pickup truck, take me to nice restaurants where he'd hold doors and pull out chairs. And he talked constantly about his close-knit family and how much he wanted me to meet them. "My parents are going to love you," he'd say, stroking my hair as we sat on his couch watching movies. "Dad's always said he wants me to find a good girl with traditional values, someone who understands the importance of family." I was so young and stupid that I actually thought that sounded romantic, like I was about to join some wonderful, supportive clan that would embrace me as their own. The first red flag should have been our first Thanksgiving dinner at the Pemberton house, but I was too infatuated to see it clearly. Harold had built this massive colonial on 5 acres of perfectly manicured land, complete with a circular driveway, 3-car garage, and the kind of landscaping that required a full-time groundskeeper. When Mark pulled up that driveway, I felt intimidated but also excited. This was clearly a successful family, and I was being welcomed into their inner circle. Harold greeted us at the front door wearing a cashmere sweater and perfectly pressed khakis, looking like he'd stepped out of a country club catalog, and his handshake was just a little too firm, just a little too long, like he was testing my strength. "So you're the famous Sarah," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mark's told us so much about you. I hope you're ready for some real family traditions." Diane fluttered around us in her apron, making a big show of how much work she'd put into the dinner, but I noticed how she kept glancing at Harold for approval before she said anything, like she was performing for an audience of one. That first dinner was a masterclass in subtle psychological warfare, though I didn't recognize it at the time. Harold dominated every conversation, telling long stories about his business successes and the important people he knew around town, while everyone else just nodded and laughed at appropriate moments. When I tried to contribute by mentioning my job at the dental office, he cut me off with, "Oh, that's nice, dear, but let me tell you about the time I had dinner with the mayor." When I complimented Diane's stuffing recipe, he immediately launched into a story about how his own mother had made the best stuffing in the state, and how nobody had ever quite been able to replicate it. Every time I spoke, he'd find a way to redirect the attention back to himself or to make some subtle dig about my background. "Mark tells me you're from a single-mother household," he said during dessert, cutting his pie with surgical precision. "That must have been difficult, not having a strong male role model growing up. But don't worry, you'll learn how real families operate." Mark just sat there nodding along, and I remember feeling confused and hurt but not understanding why. The pattern continued every time we visited after that, but Harold was clever about it. He never said anything overtly cruel or obviously offensive. Instead, he'd make comments that sounded almost complimentary on the surface, but carried a poisonous undertone that left me feeling small and worthless. When I got accepted to graduate school, he said, "Well, that's ambitious, though I've always believed that too much education can make a woman forget what's really important in life." When Mark and I got engaged, Harold's toast at our engagement party was, "Here's to Sarah, who's certainly persistent when she sets her mind to something." When I got pregnant with Emma, he patted my growing belly and said, "Let's hope this baby inherits the Pemberton intelligence genes." Every gathering became an exercise in endurance, sitting through hours of subtle humiliation while pretending to smile and be grateful for their acceptance of me into their perfect family. What made it even worse was how Mark responded to his father's behavior, or rather, how he didn't respond at all. Whenever I tried to talk to him about how Harold's comments made me feel, Mark would get defensive and make excuses. "Dad doesn't mean anything by it, he's just old-fashioned," he'd say, or "You're reading too much into it, he actually likes you." But I could see the truth in Mark's body language during those family gatherings, the way he'd tense up whenever his father spoke, the way he'd immediately defer to Harold's opinions even when they contradicted things Mark had told me privately. Mark was just as much under his father's thumb as I was, but instead of recognizing our shared predicament, he chose to sacrifice me to keep his father's approval. After Emma was born, things got even worse because now Harold had a grandchild to use as leverage. It would be such a shame if Emma grew up without knowing her grandfather, he'd say whenever I pushed back against his treatment, the implied threat hanging in the air like smoke from one of his expensive cigars. But standing there on that porch that December morning, watching Mr. Peterson calmly pull documents from his briefcase while Harold's face went from angry red to sickly pale, I finally felt the power shift in my favor for the first time in 8 years. "I'm afraid there's been a significant misunderstanding, Mr. Pemberton," Mr. Peterson said in his measured legal voice, handing Harold a certified copy of my grandmother's will and the property deed. "This house, while owned by you, is actually built on land that belongs entirely to my client, Mrs. Sarah Pemberton." I watched Harold's hands shake slightly as he took the papers, his eyes scanning the legal language that he clearly didn't understand, but definitely didn't like. Mark had appeared beside his father now, looking confused and worried, probably wondering why his wife was back with a lawyer instead of crawling away in shame like Harold had expected. "This has to be some kind of mistake," Harold stammered, but his voice had lost all its usual authority, and I could see beads of sweat forming on his forehead despite the December cold. Diane was now hovering behind both men, wringing her hands and making little gasping sounds like a fish out of water, clearly sensing that her perfect world was about to come crashing down around her manicured fingernails. The sheriff's deputy stepped forward then, a no-nonsense woman named Officer Martinez, who'd clearly dealt with situations like this before. "Sir, I need you to understand that Mrs. Pemberton has legal ownership of this land, and that gives her certain rights regarding who can and cannot remain on the property," she explained, her hand resting casually on her duty belt in a way that made Harold take an unconscious step backward. "Now, we can handle this civilly, or we can make it more complicated, but either way, we need to respect property rights here." I felt a surge of satisfaction watching Harold process the fact that he was no longer the one in control, that all his money and bluster and years of intimidation meant absolutely nothing in the face of actual legal documentation. This was the man who'd spent years making me feel like I was lucky to be tolerated in his presence, and now he was finding out that he'd been living on my land the entire time, completely dependent on my goodwill for his very roof over his head. Mark finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a squeak than his usual confident tone. "Sarah, what is this? What's going on here?" He looked genuinely bewildered, like he couldn't compute how his submissive little wife had suddenly appeared with legal backup and official documents. I turned to look at my husband, this man I'd loved and supported and defended for 8 years, this man who'd stood by and watched his father humiliate me countless times without saying a word, and I felt something cold and final settle in my chest. "What's going on, Mark? Is that your father just threw me and your daughter off what he thought was his property?" I said, my voice steady and clear for the first time in years. "But it turns out this land has been mine for the past 3 years, ever since Grandma died and left it to me in her will." I watched the color drain from Mark's face as the implications hit him, as he realized that not only had I been keeping this massive secret from him, but that his father's entire power structure was built on a foundation that belonged to the woman he'd been treating like dirt. Harold had been reading through the documents with increasing desperation, clearly hoping to find some loophole or error that would invalidate what was becoming increasingly obvious. But my grandmother's lawyer had been thorough, and the paperwork was ironclad, every signature notarized, every form filed correctly, every legal requirement met with the precision that comes from 40 years of estate planning experience. "This is impossible," Harold finally said, but his voice was weak now, defeated. "I bought this house 15 years ago. I have the deed. I've been paying taxes on this property for over a decade." Mr. Peterson nodded sympathetically, as if he genuinely felt sorry for Harold's confusion. "Yes, sir. You do own the house itself, and you have been paying taxes on the structure. But Mrs. Eleanor Brennan, Sarah's grandmother, retained ownership of the land underneath when she sold you the building. It's not uncommon in real estate transactions, particularly when the seller wants to maintain some control over how the property is used." I remembered my grandmother telling me stories about Harold when she'd first sold him the house, how arrogant and dismissive he'd been, treating her like some doddering old woman who didn't understand business. She'd been smart enough to protect herself then, and she'd been smart enough to protect me too. The neighbors were definitely watching now, some of them actually coming out onto their porches to get a better view of the drama unfolding in front of the Pemberton house. I could see Mrs. Henderson from across the street talking animatedly on her phone, probably calling all her book club friends to report on the spectacular scene. Harold noticed the growing audience too, and I could see him struggling between his need to maintain his neighborhood reputation and his growing panic about what this meant for his living situation. "Look, Sarah," he said, and for the first time in 8 years, his voice had a pleading quality that I'd never heard before. "I think we can work something out here. This is obviously a big misunderstanding, and family should stick together, right?" But I'd heard enough of Harold's manipulative words over the years to recognize the pattern. First came the threats and intimidation, then when that failed, came the fake reasonableness and appeals to family loyalty. I wasn't falling for it anymore, not when I finally held all the cards for once in my life. Diane had started crying now, real tears streaming down her carefully made-up face as the reality of their situation began to sink in. "Sarah, honey, surely we can talk about this inside, away from all these people," she said, gesturing vaguely at the neighbors who were clearly enjoying the free entertainment. "I'm sure there's been some terrible mistake, and we can sort it all out over coffee like civilized people." But I looked at this woman who'd stood by for years while her husband systematically tore down my self-esteem, who'd participated in every subtle humiliation with her nervous giggles and condescending pats on the hand. And I felt nothing but cold determination. "The only mistake, Diane, was me thinking that I had to accept being treated like garbage in order to keep this family together," I said, surprising myself with how calm and controlled my voice sounded. "But that ends today." I turned back to Mr. Peterson and nodded slightly, our prearranged signal that I was ready to proceed with the next phase of our plan. He reached into his briefcase again and pulled out another set of documents, and I watched Harold's face go from pale to absolutely ashen as he realized this legal ambush was far from over. "These documents," Mr. Peterson announced, holding up a thick manila folder, "constitute a formal notice to quit. Mrs. Pemberton is exercising her rights as the landowner to terminate your occupancy of this property." The words hit Harold like physical blows, and I watched him actually stagger backward into his own doorframe. "You have 30 days to vacate the premises, after which time Mrs. Pemberton will be within her legal rights to pursue eviction proceedings." Mark let out a strangled sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob, finally understanding that his comfortable world was crumbling around him in real time. "Sarah, you can't be serious," he said, reaching out toward me with shaking hands. "This is my family's home. This is where Emma comes to visit her grandparents. You can't just destroy everything because you're angry." But I stepped back from his touch, feeling absolutely nothing but cold resolve where my love for him used to be. "I'm not destroying anything, Mark. Your father destroyed our marriage the moment he decided I wasn't worthy of basic human respect, and you destroyed it the moment you chose his approval over your wife's dignity." The sheriff's deputy had been taking notes throughout this entire exchange, documenting everything for the official record, and now she stepped forward with her own clipboard. "I need to serve you with these papers officially," she said to Harold, extending the documents toward him with professional efficiency. Harold's hands were shaking so badly now that he could barely hold the papers, and I could see sweat stains forming under the arms of his expensive cashmere sweater. "This is insane," he kept muttering, reading through the legal language that spelled out exactly how precarious his situation had become. 30 days? 30 days to move out of my own house? This is my home. I've lived here for 15 years. I've put hundreds of thousands of dollars into renovations and improvements." Mr. Peterson adjusted his glasses and smiled that patient smile he'd perfected over decades of dealing with difficult clients. "Actually, Mr. Pemberton, those improvements belong to the landowner now, according to Connecticut property law. When you build on someone else's land, those improvements become part of the property." I could practically see the wheels turning in Harold's head as he tried to calculate how much money he'd just lost, how much of his net worth had just evaporated in the span of 15 minutes on his own front porch. The custom kitchen he'd bragged about that cost more than most people's cars, the master bathroom renovation with imported Italian marble, the finished basement with its wet bar and pool table, all of it now belonged to the granddaughter of the silly old woman. He thought he'd outsmarted 15 years ago. "You don't understand," Harold said, his voice taking on a desperate edge that I'd never heard before. "I can't just pack up and leave in 30 days. Do you have any idea how long it takes to sell a house? How long it takes to find another place to live? I have a business to run, I have obligations, I have a reputation in this community." But Mr. Peterson just shrugged sympathetically, as if Harold's problems were unfortunate, but ultimately not his concern. "Perhaps you should have considered those factors before throwing Mrs. Pemberton and her daughter off what you believed to be your property this morning." Mark had been standing there in stunned silence, but now he suddenly came alive with a burst of angry energy. "Fine, you want to play hardball? Then let's talk about Emma," he said, his voice taking on the same bullying tone his father used when he was backed into a corner. "You think any judge is going to let you keep my daughter away from her father and her grandparents? You think this little stunt is going to help you in a custody battle?" I felt a moment of pure rage at his threat, but then I remembered the other documents Mr. Peterson had prepared, the ones we hadn't shared yet. "Actually, Mark, let's talk about Emma," I said, pulling out my phone and opening the voice recording app I'd been using for the past 6 months. "Let's talk about how her grandfather called her mother worthless in front of the entire neighborhood this morning. Let's talk about how her father stood there and said nothing while it happened. Let's talk about all the times you've told me to just ignore it when your father makes cruel comments about my intelligence, my background, my parenting." I pressed play on the first recording, and Harold's voice came through the phone speaker crystal clear. "Maybe if you'd actually learned how to discipline that child properly instead of coddling her, she wouldn't be such a little brat." This was from last Thanksgiving, when 3-year-old Emma had accidentally spilled her juice on Harold's precious Persian rug. The recording continued with Mark's voice saying, "Dad's right, Sarah, you do let her get away with too much." I watched both men's faces as they heard their own words played back, realizing for the first time how cruel and harsh they sounded when stripped of all context and justification. "I have 6 months' worth of recordings," I said, stopping the playback and looking directly at Mark. 6 months of documenting the emotional abuse and toxic environment you've both created. Any family court judge who hears these will understand exactly why Emma needs to be protected from this kind of treatment. Diane had gone completely white now, understanding that her perfect family facade was about to be exposed in the most public and humiliating way possible. "Sarah, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Think about what you're doing to this family. Think about Emma, growing up with all this anger and bitterness. Is this really what you want for her?" But I looked at this woman who'd enabled her husband's cruelty for decades, who'd taught her son that women were disposable as long as you kept them financially dependent, and I felt nothing but pity for her weakness. "What I want for Emma," I said clearly, "is for her to grow up knowing that she deserves respect, that she never has to accept being treated as less than human, and that there are consequences when people cross the lines of basic human decency. What I want is for her to see her mother standing up for herself instead of cowering and making excuses for bullies." Officer Martinez had been watching this family drama unfold with the patience of someone who'd seen it all before, but now she stepped forward to wrap up the official business. "Mr. Pemberton, you've been legally served with eviction papers," she said, handing Harold her card. "If you have any questions about the process or need information about tenant rights, you can contact the court clerk's office." "Mrs. Pemberton, is there anything else you need from me today?" I looked around at the faces of these people who'd made my life miserable for 8 years. Harold with his arrogant expression finally replaced by genuine fear. Diane with her perfect makeup streaked by tears. Mark with his weak chin trembling as he realized his comfortable world was ending. "Actually, there is one more thing," I said, reaching into my purse for the final document that would complete Harold's humiliation. I need to give Mr. Pemberton this bill for back rent. I handed him a carefully calculated invoice for 8 years of land use at fair market value, plus interest and late fees. The total came to just over $400,000, more money than Harold had liquid, more than he could possibly pay without selling everything he owned. Harold stared at the bill with bulging eyes, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. For $100,000, he finally managed to choke out. "You expect me to pay you $400,000 for land I didn't even know you owned?" Mr. Peterson nodded, as if this were perfectly reasonable. Connecticut law is quite clear on this matter. When someone uses another person's land without permission, they're liable for fair market rent, regardless of whether they were aware of the ownership situation. I watched Harold's face cycle through every emotion possible: rage, disbelief, panic, and finally a kind of broken defeat that told me he was beginning to understand the true scope of what was happening to him. His entire empire, built on intimidation and financial control, was crumbling because he'd finally pushed the wrong person too far. The man who'd spent years making me feel powerless and small was now completely at my mercy, and we both knew it. The neighbors had formed quite an audience by now, some of them actually bringing out lawn chairs to watch the proceedings like it was free theater. I could see Harold's face burning with shame as he realized that his public humiliation was being witnessed by every important person in his social circle. These were the people he'd bragged to about his successful business, his perfect family, his beautiful home, and now they were all watching him get served with eviction papers by his own daughter-in-law. "This isn't over," he finally said, but his voice was hollow and defeated, the voice of a man who knew he'd already lost everything that mattered to him. "I'll fight this in court. I'll appeal every decision. I'll make your life hell." But I just smiled at him, the kind of calm, confident smile I'd learned from watching Mr. Peterson handle difficult clients for the past 3 years. "Harold," I said quietly, "you've been making my life hell for 8 years. The difference is, now I have the power to stop you. And trust me, I will use every bit of that power to protect myself and my daughter from your toxicity." As I walked back to my car with Emma in my arms, leaving behind the wreckage of the only family I'd known for nearly a decade, I felt lighter than I had in years. Behind me, I could hear Harold and Mark arguing with each other, their voices raised in panic and blame, while Diane sobbed on the porch steps. But their drama was no longer my responsibility. Their dysfunction was no longer my problem to solve. I had my daughter, I had my financial independence, and I had my dignity back. Most importantly, I had shown Emma that no one, not even family, has the right to treat you with disrespect, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away from people who refuse to value you. That night, as I tucked Emma into bed in our new apartment, she looked up at me with her big brown eyes and said, "Mommy, why was Grandpa so mean to you?" And for the first time in 8 years, I was able to give her an honest answer. Sometimes people are mean because they're scared, sweetheart. But we don't have to stay around mean people, even if they're family. We get to choose who we spend our time with, and we choose people who are kind. 3 months later, when Harold's eviction was final and he'd moved into a cramped apartment across town, I drove past the beautiful colonial house that was now legally mine. I smiled, knowing that my grandmother would be proud that her gift had finally served its purpose, not just as financial security, but as the key to my freedom from a family that never deserved me in the first place.